Hi, how are you doing? We're looking at social process theories now, and those are going to relate back to the theories we just talked about in Chapter 6, which were social structure theories. This one, we're going to orient a little bit differently than we just were. As I said, we talked about social structure theories in the previous slide, and those consider the effects of what you could call the macro environment. Okay, macro, remember from biology, means big. So when you think of structure, think of the big picture, like, for example, the structure of society, the structure of social inequality. Right? This is a larger social structure, and I tend to think of like grids to understand these macro relationships. That's the idea behind social structure theory. Social process theory is focused on what's called the micro environment, the smaller environment. And the micro environment involves things like face-to-face individual social interactions. So in some ways, the social process theory, you can't have social structure without social process, okay? So you can't have social structure without individual interactions, without the idea of interpersonal relationships, face-to-face communication, socialization, the process by which we learn how to be human, and things like labeling, symbols and their meanings that are put on things. All of that stuff is related to crime, and that's the focus of this chapter, social processes, okay? Process means just something as it unfolds over time. These are important because they're social psychological processes that everybody, they're common to everyone in all the social structure. We all do this, we all have this, right? So what's interesting is we talked about these theories really explaining crime primarily with the idea that it relates to social inequality. These theories are more about socialization and how we learn to be human. So a very different set of explanations we'll consider in this chapter. And that's captured in the last phrase here. Unlike the social structure theories, social process theories argue or posit that everyone has a potential to become a criminal. Because even though not all of us are poor and therefore vulnerable to committing crime, which would be the explanation of the social structure theorists, we all are socialized and we're all humans who have interpersonal relationships. So social process theories explain potentially crimes by all individuals. If you've had an introduction to sociology course, then you're familiar with some of what we'll talk about here, the major sources of socialization. We go through these, and I'll talk a little bit about how they relate to crime, but again, they're familiar to a lot of people, so don't need to belabor the point so much. Everyone, most everyone, has a family, right? Unless you're an orphan. And the family is really the first arena for socialization, if you will. It's the first way in which we learn how to become human beings. So you learn a lot from your family. You learn basic norms and values. You learn physical skills, probably your first use of language. You learn some physical skills and how to control yourself, things that you carry with you for the rest of your life. So family is a crucial point of socialization for a lot of people. The studies in your textbook focus on things like the role of family conflict and tension in terms of promoting crime. And the studies they look at say very clearly that if you have conflict and tension in an ongoing way in your family, those promote antisocial behavior and crime. Because the template that you've got for social relationships is one of conflict. And so some people used to talk about the broken home as the source of crime and delinquency. Now, what's a broken home? Broken means it's shattered. It doesn't work. And the broken home is connected to the notion of divorce. Kids came from these homes were seen as less able to function. So in the past, the research was on the broken home and its relationship to delinquency and crime. These days, more focus is put on the amount of conflict and tension within a home. So that's very different because you probably heard this phrase, parents who stay together for the kids. That doesn't necessarily work because if there's two people who again have this conflict and ongoing tension, the kids are going to see that. So there are studies that really say that it isn't about whether or not parents are single parents or divorced. It's really about the quality of the interaction with people at home, right? If you have a lot of ongoing conflict and tension, you're going to have problems with your kids because that's the template, that's what they learn. And that's my point here, point B. Family conflict and tension may be related to the family structure, but not necessarily. The previous research really emphasized the structure of the family, whether they were divorced or single parents. These days it's more about the process of the family, how the family comes to decisions, what they do when there are conflicts. There's also some research conducted lately that focuses on the type of family and the way that they interact with each other and how they change over time, how kids are socialized. One huge factor in raising children, which many of you want to do or are doing, is studies show that consistency and discipline is crucial. Kids thrive in environments where there are patterns, where they know the expectations, and they have an idea of consequences. So inconsistent discipline can be a huge problem for children who are just learning how to behave. If they don't know what's going to happen from one moment to the next by doing the same thing, they learn that they don't know and they can't control it, and it doesn't matter what they do. Okay. Poor supervision is an important factor too in delinquency and crime. That can be related to family structure. If you come from a divorced home, for example, maybe that one parent can't supervise you a lot. So it can be related to social structure, whether or not you're supervised or not, but not necessarily. For example, President Obama came from a single parent home, and he had an extended family who provided supervision for him. So supervision levels can relate to family structure, but not necessarily. Lack of love certainly will cause somebody to have low self-esteem and feel badly about themselves and maybe not care about how they interact with others or what they do and whether it's right or wrong. Child abuse, that's going to be connected with, again, self-esteem and how a child sees themselves and their role and place in the world, whether they're comfortable or not. That can be related to things like sexual abuse, which your textbook talks about in some length as connected with certain patterns of crime and antisocial behavior, a poor sense of self, and also the notion of childhood neglect. Perhaps you've read a book many students in Nebraska have called A Child Called It, and talks about abuse and neglect as very formative in the life of the author and how he had to overcome some very, very large obstacles in order to gain a sense of stability and self-esteem and comfort with himself. The second big area of socialization that we all encounter, the school, the educational experience, actually what we're doing right now in a very different way through media, a different way than we have ever done in the past, right? So schools you can look at as the first institution to label kids. And the label that you place on a person is very important for how they see themselves and how others treat them. So whether or not a child is labeled exceptional or gifted or remedial or stupid in some instances, maybe kids will call those names, that can very much affect how someone sees themselves. There are over 100 studies, so a lot of research about how academic performance is a significant predictor of an individual's future crime and delinquency. It is a commonsensical thing. Kids who do well in school are not necessarily really interested in crime as much as those kids who don't do well and want another source of self-esteem or positive reinforcement. Kids who do well in school, have good academic performance, typically are not involved in crime or delinquency. Those kids who drop out of high school and are expelled, both of those things, because you can have both of them, are significantly more likely, and that's statistically significant. That's a particular meaning, which means much more likely to have some type of criminal career. The third important socialization source, the peer group, is unique. It has some particular characteristics that are useful to think about. And you come from your family and your parents, there's hopefully the idea of unconditional love, right? They accept you for who you are, kind of no matter what you do, they'll always like you. The peers are fickle, right? Because peers are your social equals, and they don't have to like you. There comes a point where you had a class where you didn't get Valentine's every time that Valentine's Day passed, right? For the first few years, yeah, you all got Valentines from everybody, but then eventually that stopped and you begin to realize, well, nobody has to like you. Also, too, peers have their own sets of values and things that they communicate that are of importance to them. And often parents feel a little bit of frustration when kids first encounter schools or peer groups. An example of this, my mom loves to tell, is that she, before I first went off to school, I was raised in a house where the food didn't have really any processed sugar. So she would send me to school with these wonderful lunches, and they would have cut up apples and whole wheat sandwiches and juice, very nutritious and good. And then I went to school and I started to come home feeling very hungry. And mom was like, why is this? I wouldn't fess up. I wouldn't say what was going on. So mom asked my teacher to keep an eye on me, and my teacher reported back to my mom during a parent-teacher conference. She said that Kurt is trading his lunch for Oreo cookies. So my mom learned that idea that you can only influence your kids and their values so much. And then the school comes in and the peers come in and they might offer very different lessons. And this is important to think about because peers are a major influence, again, like just off of early days in school, like first grade. By the time you're 8, into the ages of 8 to 14, peers are becoming very, very important for the types of values that kids start to hold and think about. And that's captured in this phrase that children often learn and share the values of their peers. So depending on what their peers like, that may be what they like. What's popular and cool at certain points, of course, changes a lot. But kids are, of course, interested in conforming and belonging to their peer groups. There's also, though, a second issue related to peer groups and delinquency. Kids who are excluded from peer groups might exhibit some type of ongoing antisocial tendencies as well. So sometimes kids can be influenced by their peer groups in a negative way. They learn delinquency or bad behavior. But kids who are left out of peer groups, they may become antisocial for a whole different set of reasons. Next, social process theory has 3 branches that I'd like you to commit to memory. And that's like the 3 branches that I also asked you to know about from the social structural theories we talked about in the last chapter. So these 3 branches for social process theories to know about: social learning theory, control theory, and social reaction or labeling theory. I'll walk through the basics of each one, and then again we're going to go into more depth with further slides. Social learning theory, the major assumption here, criminal behavior is learned through interaction. And that's something that came off of a very, very big emphasis on biological-based theories of crime. It sounds very strange, but the idea that people can learn crime is something we take for granted, but was a very important innovation for some theorists, particularly Edwin Sutherland, who we'll talk about in a moment. Control theory. This is a different type of social process. The idea here is that human beings are controlled through close associations with individuals they care about and institutions that they want to be a part of. The final branch here, social reaction theory, is sometimes also called labeling theory. It's interchangeable, those two ideas. This focuses on the application of labels and the definition of what counts as crime. So labeling theory says some people are labeled criminal, and that happens through authorities, and that's going to change how they are treated by other people, how they think of themselves. Also, too, labeling theory is going to be involving what things count as crime, because certain things become labeled as crime, maybe again through a different process, and that changes over time as well. Now we can look at the different theories that fall under these branches. So one theory that falls under the category of social learning theories is the work of a guy who, believe it or not, was born in Gibbon, Nebraska, like 17 miles from Kearney. And Edwin Sutherland is his name, and he came up with what's called Differential Association Theory. One of my professors had this great thing that she taught me. She said, if something is named well, then you can get a lot of information just from the name of the theory. All right. So in this instance, differential association means that criminals associate with different kinds of people and learn different kinds of things. Differential association. So Sutherland came up with this theory in 1939, and you can remember that that's kind of coming toward the end of a prominent set of theories, biologically based theories. Sutherland's saying maybe it isn't just biology that's involved in how people become criminal, it's maybe how they learn or what they learn. So a big key point, which we may think of as very simple, it was a pretty important thing at the time, was crime can be learned. It isn't necessarily biological. Sutherland's saying criminal behavior can be learned. How's it learned? Usually by interacting with people in small personal groups, face-to-face interaction. That's how people learn crime. And they learn things the way that we all learn things, through our face-to-face ongoing interactions with people. What do they learn? Obviously, criminals learn techniques, right? Like how to hotwire a car. It's a technique that you would use to commit a crime. You learn maybe also motives for crime. Like you would hotwire a car because people will think you're cool. You'll have a car to ride around in for a while. It gives you some status and a good feeling, okay? The other things, though, you might learn are attitudes. Like, for example, instead of thinking the police are there to protect you, the police are pigs. They're people you want to get over, and they're people who are against members of your community or racial group, typically. And that, again, that definition, the police are not helpful and protectors of you. They're pigs and people you want to be very wary of, right? So criminals learn not only techniques, but also things like motives, attitudes, and definitions that favor criminal behavior. The third point is that an individual's perspectives on the legal code is going to influence their motives and drives. So they might think of the legal code as something that benefits well-off people and works against poor people or people like themselves. And that's going to influence how they feel about the world and whether or not they think crime is something they should do or might be interested in doing. Sutherland's arguing that somebody's going to become criminal when they reach what you could think of as a tipping point, a point where the balance of thought has shifted, right? They change their minds. So a person's going to become criminal when they see or perceive that there are more favorable consequences to violating the law than unfavorable consequences, that there's more to be gained from violating the law than to upholding the law or being in step with it. The final idea with differential association is the extent to which someone learns these things. It's going to depend on a lot of variables. Things like the duration, the amount of time maybe that someone spends with a group of people. The frequency with which you come in contact with people is going to affect what you learn and how you learn. The priority of the relationship, right? And also the intensity of the relationship. Some people have a very intense relationship, for example, with fellow gang members that isn't matched by anything else. So those are the 4 variables that Sutherland looked at in terms of how we learn and the process of learning. This leads into the major criticism of differential association theory. It has some clear strengths, also has some weaknesses. One of the big ones is that the terms that Sutherland used were somewhat vague. It's very difficult to operationalize, for example, what exactly you are meaning by something like intensity or the duration. They could be operationalized, but for example, things like what is a definition favorable to criminal behavior? So an excess of definitions toward criminality, what exactly does that mean in real terms? It's very hard to test empirically, and so Sutherland's theory is something that's abstract, but we haven't necessarily been able to test it empirically yet. After Sutherland's theory, in 39-ish, you start to see other theories develop, and one of them is by Burgess and Akers, and this comes in 1966. It's called Differential Reinforcement Theory. So again, if you think of the name, this one is about different kinds of reinforcements that people might get, which incline them toward crime or have a negative sanction which inhibit them from crime. So Burgess and Akers take differential association theory. They take Sutherland's theory we just talked about, which says you commit crime based on who you associate with and what you learn from them. They take that theory and they combine it with psychological learning theories. So 30 years later, they're interested in applying psychological learning theories to these groups of people that Sutherland looked at. And they make an argument that behavior is going to be differentially reinforced. Some behavior is rewarded, some behavior is punished during interaction. We don't get the same messages about behavior. There are psychological processes involved with this too. So you have associations. You might associate, for example, crime with feelings of pleasure. Okay, you might also be involved with imitation. You might learn from seeing other people do things. And that's a psychological process. And also, too, cognitive definitions that favor or are unfavorable to crime. So again, some of this is similar to the previous work of Sutherland, but some definitions, again, might emerge that change how you think. Okay, and that's going to relate to whether or not you do crime. So the important thing is, it's not just groups that influence whether or not you become criminal, your behavior, but whether or not you receive a sanction, like people saying, don't do that, that's terrible, I'm not going to be your friend, or you receive a reinforcement, which says, wow, you're doing something really neat there when you shoplift or steal cars. I think that's cool, and we really like you because of that. If your group likes some of the things you do that are criminal, but doesn't like others, then that's going to influence your patterns of crime. Another social learning theory that Larry Siegel discusses is the work of Gresham Sykes and David Matza. And this is called Neutralization Theory. And sometimes it's called drift theory. All right? Those are synonyms for the same idea. This came a little bit later still, I think. Well, actually, this was, I think, around the 50s that this was published. I believe it was the Journal of the American Sociological Association at the time. And this is an interesting theory because it's talking about the motives that criminals have and the values that they have. The first premise is that most people share conventional values, right? We generally tend to follow manners. We don't break rules a lot of the time. Even criminals conform to basic social norms and values most of the time. What makes them different, what makes criminals different according to Sykes and Matza, is that they develop techniques and attitudes that allow them to neutralize their typical, everyday, accepted values and drift away from them. They drift away from conventional behavior to deviant behavior. Now, how do you do that? You end up thinking about things and you end up talking about the things differently than you would if you accepted them without any question. And Sykes and Matza come up with 5 techniques that criminals often use and delinquents often use to neutralize what they've done, to make it seem like, well, this is a reason for doing those things that would otherwise seem bad. Let's walk through these and get examples for each one. Denial of responsibility. I often think about this one in relationship to students, because one of the things that happens if you're a professor is students will come to you and say, Dr. Bouchard, I missed class because of, and they're typical excuses, right? You know a lot of them. I am sick, someone passed away in my family, my car died, something like this. So let's say, for example, somebody says, my car stopped working, my car broke down. That person is not saying that they aren't responsible for the class and whatever we did that day. What they're saying is they're not responsible for what happened with their car. They didn't choose to have their car die. It's something that just happened. So their responsibility is something happened that didn't allow them to meet their responsibility. So that is a technique of neutralization when a person denies responsibility. Denial of injury is also a technique, and again, with language, you can see that people will sometimes say, well, nobody was hurt in whatever I did that was wrong. So maybe, for example, someone steals a piece of clothing from Walmart, just as an example. The individual might say to themselves, hey, Walmart's a huge corporation, they make a lot of money, they can handle this loss of $10 to $20, right? That is denial of injury. Another way of thinking about it too is something maybe like somebody drawing graffiti on a wall. They might say, nobody got hurt, right? So that's saying it's okay, and that lets them drift away from the normal values. Denial of victim here is also sometimes called denial of an innocent victim. And you frequently see this with the idea of rapists who want to justify or explain their behavior in some way by saying the victim brought it on herself. They'll say things like, oh, she was wearing revealing and provocative clothing, she was at a bar late at night, she was flirting with a lot of people, she has a history of promiscuity. And I'm not saying those things are right. I'm saying they're perfect examples of techniques of neutralization where they're saying this person brought it on herself from her own behavior. The last two here, condemning the condemners. This is when people point out how someone's a hypocrite, right? So maybe a kid who's 16, he comes home at night and he's been drinking, and his parents say, hey, why are you drinking? And he says, Why do you care? You drink every weekend or every day. That's saying you're hypocrites, you people who enforce the rules. Another common joke in Los Angeles among gang members is they say, well, what's the biggest gang in LA? The LAPD. So that's saying the people who enforce the rules do it in an arbitrary way, they abuse power, condemning the condemners. Final one, appeal to higher loyalties. This is often seen, for example, with gang members or terrorists. They could say very easily that those groups made them do it. They were basically told this is what you do to be part of us. And so that's the appeal of the higher loyalties. They influence behavior beyond basic norms and rules. And what's fascinating about the appeal to higher loyalties is to think those might be individuals who, if they hadn't joined those groups, would never have thought of doing those crimes. The criminal activity is a function of the group and what it asks of its members. Next, social control theories. These focus on two different things: self-control and a person being committed to conformity. There are two different branches we'll be discussing here, and I'll go through the first one on this slide and then the second on the following. The guy's name is a fun name if you're a criminologist, good career choice for him. Walter Reckless is his name, who came up with the idea of containment theory. And there are containments that kids have. He focused primarily on juveniles. Containments, such as things like, for example, proper socialization, are combined, and that's that plus sign, containments that are combined with things like a good self-image and ego strength. Those things are going to allow kids to resist becoming criminals. So, if you think back, for example, to Elijah Anderson we talked about before, there are going to be families with decent values. Reckless would argue that if those kids have inner containments, like families that promote values, like obey the law, be a good citizen, plus if those kids have a positive self-image and they have good ego strength, then they're not going to be influenced to commit crime. The strong self-image will help those kids in those really bad neighborhoods, violent neighborhoods, counteract whatever internal pushes that they have. Like, for example, maybe they feel aggressive. They'll direct that towards sports, perhaps, right? So they won't succumb to drives, making them move in a criminal direction. The strong self-image will also help kids avoid external pressures, so environmental conditions, like living in a slum. Finally, the strong self-image, the ego strength, will allow kids to resist external pulls, things like, for example, personal and social influences from people in the person's general milieu, the neighborhood that they see all the time, gang members and whatnot, or maybe friends that might try to lead them into crime. They can resist those things if they have good self-image and ego strength. The second branch of social control theory I want to discuss with you is this notion of social bond theory. It's the work of a fellow named Travis Hershey, who wrote this theory up around 40 plus years ago. And he's an interesting fellow because what he did was to take a question that a lot of people ask in criminology and turn it around. A lot of criminologists want to know, why is it that certain people do bad things? Obvious question. He flips that and he says, what stops the majority of people from doing bad things? Why don't we all do bad things? What stops us? The answer, he found, social bonds. Again, the answer is in the name of the theory itself. So social bonds between the individual and the group result in conformity. He came up with 4 social bonds. I'll talk about 2 on this slide, 2 on the next slide. Most of you probably feel attached to some people in your life, and you are concerned with what they think of you. Right? Have you ever had that experience where you're about to do something just god-awful dumb, and you hear the voice of your parents in your head saying, "Kurt, what are you doing? Stop and think this through." You hear your own parents' voice say your name, and that stops you. These are attachments. We have stable patterns of interaction between ourselves and the people who we care the most about, right? And we care very, very deeply about what they think. So that's why you hear your parents' voice. Your parents say, "Don't do that," or "Think very carefully before you do that," because we care about you, we love you, we don't want you to get hurt, right? You can relate this to different periods in a person's life. For example, like the period of adolescence. Think back to your own adolescence and think about whether or not you were really happy and having a great relationship with your parents at that time. A lot of people have some tension and problems, and that means that that's a likely period for deviance and delinquency, because you're more alienated from those people, your parents, who you once felt a strong attachment to. You're trying to find your own way as an adult, right? So that means the attachment is strained at that point, and that explains adolescent deviance or delinquency. There's also a larger tendency toward deviance and delinquency for, well, I guess not delinquency, because young people are supposed to be single. Let's try that again. It explains high rates of deviance and crime for people who are single and divorced, as opposed to those in families. So you can relate this back to Robert Merton and especially Emil Durkheim, because Durkheim's theory about anomie, so that people who are not attached to others, who don't have those people who share beliefs with them, those people are at risk for normlessness, right? So that's the same kind of explanation that Durkheim in particular made for crime. This theory of Hershey's also explains that if you have, for example, a class-based theory of crime, which is more based on those strain theories, they don't necessarily work too well, because even people from lower social classes can have very strong bonds with law-abiding family members, and they care about what they think, and so it can really explain that there isn't much correlation necessarily between whether or not you're poor or rich and whether or not you're going to engage in crime. So the first big thing to know as far as the types of social bonds, attachments. That's the number one thing. Commitments, second big important type of bond for Hershey. Commitments he saw as our stake in conformity. And what he found was that over time, we gain more and more of a stake in conformist type behavior. So, as an example, if you gain more education or wealth, crime looks less appealing because you have more to lose than you do to gain. Great example. I have a PhD and I have a good job, been working a long time to get there. It would be just unbelievably stupid if I were to go out and engage in shoplifting today, because that would negate the value of my education and it would probably take away my source of income. So we become more and more involved in being conformists, following the same general path over time. So as we get older, we tend to keep conforming. We conform more and more because we're more embedded in what's expected of us. And it also helps explain that people who have more education are far less likely to engage in aberrant criminal type acts. The final two social bonds that Travis Hershey talked about, involvements and beliefs. So let's talk about involvements first. Involvements, and if you focus on, for example, juveniles, this makes a lot of sense. Involvements are the amount of time that you spend conforming, meaning that you have less time for antisocial criminal activities. So let's think this through. If we're talking about the primary time when kids are likely to engage in delinquency, it's between 3 and 6 p.m.-ish. This is a general idea. Why then? It's because kids get out of school around 3-ish, and their parents usually may not come home until after work, like 6. So, Hershey's arguing that a good way to keep your kids from becoming delinquent would be to involve them in things like church activities, after school activities, athletics, these kinds of things. Because if your kids are busy, then they can't get in trouble. Perfect explanation. The final one of the bonds, beliefs. Remember when you did the exercise where I asked you if you wanted to steal $1 million and said there was a 0% chance of getting caught? Hershey says that the reason some of you said, I won't do it, because it's wrong, right? It's against my morals and my belief system. So even though, again, I gave you the perfect setup for a rational choice that would benefit you by committing crime, you might have stopped yourself, some of you, I'm sure did, because of beliefs that you've internalized. As I mentioned here, Hershey used this type of theory primarily in explanation and the study of juvenile delinquency. What types of things would help juveniles avoid crime? Okay. That leads into the next theories of crime and a whole group of ideas that different researchers are credited with. Social reaction and labeling theory. The main guy I'm going to talk about on the next slide, related to what's called primary and secondary deviance, is Edwin Lemert. Okay. He's a founder of labeling theory and the ideas of primary and secondary deviance. That's coming up in a minute. But there are other important names, and I'll mention a couple of them. Howard Becker, he came up with a book called Outsiders, and a very influential book in sociology and criminology. Kai Erikson developed theories that we'll talk about in a minute, and John Kitchus is also a name associated with this theoretical camp. Labeling theory, or social reaction theory. Labeling and social reaction theory has roots in what's called symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is a theory in sociology that was developed first around the 1920s and 30s by George Herbert Mead and another fellow, Charles Horton Cooley. So these guys are coming from the Chicago school we talked about in an earlier discussion. What are they doing? They're symbolic interactionists that argue that people interact using symbols. That's a very important element of what makes us human. And the way that we interpret symbols is important. And the way that those symbols are interpreted can affect a person's self-concept and how others conceptualize that person and the behavior that they're engaged in. So symbolic interactionism is a very important cornerstone to the development of labeling theories, how certain things are labeled crime, certain things are labeled criminal, and how criminals themselves are labeled. There are 4 key assumptions with labeling theory I want to talk with you about. The first assumption is that everybody is committing crime. You have done it, I've done it, you might have done it today. It's stuff that we do and often usually don't get called on it or caught. So we all engage in things like jaywalking, speeding, basic traffic violations, you forget to turn on a turn signal, you have a broken light, something like this. That all is what Lamert calls primary deviance. We all engage in basic law-breaking behavior from time to time. You might take a pen from your work environment. That's theft. These kinds of things, right? Everyone does it. The thing is that even people who are criminal and deviant really conform the majority of the time. Right? Even criminals follow basic social norms and rules and decorum for behavior. What happens is that when a person is caught and labeled, okay, so a person who's caught and labeled, when that happens, the person is encouraged to transform how they think of themselves by accepting the label. So if you've ever had that experience where you've been driving on an interstate, suddenly there's a car that comes behind you and it's got those flashing disco lights and that really loud siren, and you pull over and your heart's beating a little bit too hard and not in pace, and you think, oh, shame on me, I'm being shamed here. And you might, for example, in some places have that noted in the local paper. That is a label that's being placed on you. And that label, the strength of the label and the way in which it's applied, you might come to accept it. You're very much encouraged to accept it. That causes a shift into what Lamert called secondary deviance. That is a fundamental change in self-identity and how others see you. There are important factors involved in this labeling, though. One of them is the role of power. Who is creating the label and applying the label, right? If your friends label you a cheater in college, it doesn't necessarily have much force, but if a teacher labels you that and it comes to affect your transcripts, that has more teeth, right? There's also not only just power, but the fact that rules are not enforced the same way across different groups of people. So one example of this is powerless people are a lot more likely to be targeted by authorities because it's easier for them to do. That's why you might see people who are in certain neighborhoods who actually get used to being pulled over or addressed by the police. It becomes something familiar to them. They're familiar with that power differential. The social distance between those individuals and the people who are in authority is quite great. And that means that that'll affect who gets targeted, right? If you happen to be the son or daughter of the mayor of Kearney and a police officer pulls you over, I imagine that person might treat you differently than the average everyday citizen. So the role of power and the differential enforcement of rules comes to affect what is labeled crime and who is labeled criminal. Being labeled criminal can carry very profound effects. And one of them is captured nicely with the phrase stigma. As I said, if you're getting pulled over by a police officer and your friends see it, that's going to feel maybe a little bit sickening for you. Let's say, for example, you were convicted of a crime, just as a thought experiment. Let's say from this moment forward, you've been convicted of burglary. You may not have done this crime, but it doesn't matter because you've been convicted of it. That in and of itself is going to have effects, and a big one is going to be a stigmatized identity. So you're going to have reactions from people, and that's going to limit you in many different ways. Probably one of the biggest ones would be the types of jobs you could get. Most people have those forms that they fill out for an application, and there's a little spot and it says, please check this box if you've been convicted of a felony, and most people go, oh, no, I haven't been, so they don't check the box. But sometimes people have been, and they have to check it. I have a video that I show in my juvenile delinquency class, and it's of a young man who was convicted as a juvenile of participating in a gang-related murder. It talks with his, the video is talking with his parole officer, and it's a fascinating conversation because she says he's in a tight spot. He can either check the box, I did a felony, and then probably a lot of people will not even consider him for a job. Or he can leave it blank. He can essentially lie. And he might then get an opportunity, but then through a criminal background check is found to be criminal, and he's hoping maybe, and this is what the parole officer says, he's hoping that they'll at least have seen that he's an okay person, that he'd say, hey, you would never have given me a chance otherwise. So that is speaking to the idea that some type of criminal record can limit your jobs quite dramatically. Might also limit where you can live, and who will rent to you, or who will sell to you. It might limit how much credit you can get, what kind of credit you can get, and even what interest you would pay on that. If you're a child and you're labeled, you might be treated differently at home or at school based on the label that you receive. Perhaps you've been labeled developmentally disabled at school or remedial, then that might come to affect how your parents see you. And also too, if you have siblings who constantly call you dumb and stupid, that might affect how you perform at school. Another big effect of being labeled is that it might change the kind of people you regularly encounter and can interact with. There would be people who might never want to interact with you again if you've been convicted of a burglary. Even if you didn't do it, the conviction might cause people to not want to associate with you anymore, including family. Those things together might very much change how you feel about yourself. If you take on the label of a bad person, a criminal, then you're not going to feel good about yourself, which is fascinating because most people have heard the phrase, and maybe you have too, I'm pretty sure. If you do the crime, you do the time. How familiar are you with that? You've probably heard of it. This is saying, labeling theory is saying that not only do you do the time, but you do other forms of punishment long after your sentence has been completed. And that can include a changed sense of self. Sometimes, too, labeling creates a situation for retrospective reading. That means that someone's actions are reinterpreted through the filter of the new label. So as an example, if someone decides that they are an alcoholic, they start going to AA meetings, this kind of thing, their friends might say, oh, that's right, I saw him and he was getting drunk quite often, and I saw that fight with his family, and that's probably related to alcohol too, and oh, the problems he's been having with work are related to alcohol. So you begin to see a pattern where you couldn't have possibly seen one before, based on the application of the label. Labels can have positive and negative effects. Some people would argue that if you take on the label of a secondary deviant, then it might be the first step toward changing yourself, owning up to your past. So for example, by admitting that you're an alcoholic, you've taken a big, big step toward changing that type of behavior because it's rooted in some behaviors that you've had for a long period of time connected to your personality. And it might be something you have to watch for the rest of your life, which is why people claim they're an alcoholic even if they haven't had a drink for decades. A couple of other ideas related to this. One is Howard Becker's concept. We talked about Becker a moment ago is important in this area. He created a concept, the notion of moral entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur you can think of as somebody who is successful in business usually, makes things happen. For Becker, he's making a case that we create deviance and crime because of the laws that we choose, right? There is no natural crime or deviance. Every society defines it somewhat differently depending on context, circumstances, and ideas about what they want to prohibit. So social groups can come along and create deviance by making new rules. And they make rules where if you break them, then you become deviant. It's a strange idea. It makes sense to people. Of course, law changes over time. We talked about that with the sociology of law. But the idea here is that we can have social groups defining how we perceive reality. And that links back to a previous concept, malo prohibitum. Malo prohibitum are laws that can change over time depending on maybe who's advocating for that change in law, right? So social movements can come along, like for example, the movement that considered smoking to be a great health risk, and that social movement may create crime and may create a very strong label against certain behaviors. So when I was a kid, you could smoke in government buildings, you could smoke in offices. Now a lot of that has been criminalized. You can't do it anymore. And that's because of a social movement. There are a couple of other examples. You can think of MAD, the acronym for Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Why would mothers make such an effective group in order to change law? Because the assumption with that name is that they might be mothers who've had a child killed or seriously injured by a drunk driver. So they are wanting that law changed. And in fact, they were very successful in changing the law starting only 35 years ago in the 80s, that the laws really started to get some teeth against drinking, the laws against drinking and driving. Another moral entrepreneur, Ralph Nader, who ran for president a few years ago. He was the founding person behind the contemporary consumer advocate movement. So he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which was largely about a friend of his who died because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. They didn't have them back then. So Nader said cars need to have these seatbelts. He said it has to be mandatory, it has to be law that they're always included in cars. And now even we take it for granted that there are laws that you have to use seatbelts. That's the idea behind moral entrepreneurs. Our final slide under these social process theories talks about more limitations with these labels and labeling theories and some of the problems. One thing about labeling theory, it's curious, is a notion that was promoted by Kai Erikson. And here's his phrasing. The amount of deviance is limited by the capacity of a social apparatus to handle deviancy. So the amount of deviance is limited by the social apparatus that's in place to handle deviancy. It's a strange, overly complex sentence, I think. What it means in simpler terms is that in order to have crime labeled, you have to have people who are charged with labeling it. If you have, for example, high crime rates, that's going to relate directly in part to the number of police who are enforcing the law. There are always government officials who say, you know, I'm going to get hard on crime. I'm going to lower crime rates. Well, here's a weird thing to think about. One way to lower crime rates would be to get rid of police, right? In some ways, because you wouldn't have the people who would be there to record the crime. So in some sense, the idea is that you see and know about deviance depending on how many law enforcement officials you have. And changing the number of people charged with looking out for crime is going to affect how much you see and how many deviant labels of deviance are applied to people. Another important caveat with labeling theory, what counts as crime is not necessarily based on consensus of the majority. Sometimes crime is really about what powerful people think ought to be considered crime. So labels that are applied sometimes are very different in terms of the amount of stigma attached to them. So white-collar crime often is not seen as something that's terribly, terribly bad. But in terms of social harm, it can be disproportionately bad to street-level crime, which is what we often think of as real crime. And that's, again, related to how the laws are developed and who, if the majority, are thinking about these definitions of crime and creating them. There's also selective enforcement of law, we've talked about before. Law enforcement can be very selective and arbitrary. Why is it that sometimes there are crackdowns on crime? Why is it that sometimes certain areas are targeted for more law enforcement or less law enforcement? Why is it that poor people who may be engaged in more visible criminal acts are targeted by police, and middle class and upper class people who may do drugs behind gated communities don't get targeted as much? So how law enforcement plays out affects who's labeled and the type of label they get. The last three things then to think about with labeling theory. The power and resources of the accused is going to affect whether or not they're labeled. If you can afford the best lawyers that will contradict DNA evidence, that will have their own expert testimony about things, you can afford those people, and you're a powerful person, then you might be able to avoid being labeled. The tolerance level of the community. Some communities are going to be very tolerant of behavior, and others not so much. So right now we're seeing this play out with medical marijuana in some states. There's a general tolerance for marijuana being used to treat disease, or to treat symptoms, I should say, of disease. Other communities, not so much. They won't tolerate that behavior. So tolerance level is important for labeling. And the visibility. Like I said before, if you're doing drugs in the open because you really have to do it that way if you're poor, versus somebody who has dealers who can come to their house and be removed completely from public scrutiny, a very different way of being in the world and maybe avoiding the label of criminal.